And today we are here at the Linux Certification Virtual Summit, and we are talking to David Morgan. David Morgan is currently in the cybersecurity field, and he has over 25 years of experience in investigations, cybersecurity, information systems, and he is currently a professor at the University of Maryland University College. David, thank you for being here and welcome. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Tiffany. Thank you for having me.
Perfect, perfect. So tell me who is David Morgan?
Well, the I first got introduced into or interested in computers. Pretty much, much like everybody else did. I saw them on TV or came across them in a store. I think my first computer was a dual floppy, no hard drive type of old PC, and it was well over $2,000. So we'd come a long way. But my background begins. I was for a while I worked for the state in the prison system, and then upon entering Marine Corps, when I became a criminal investigator, we were more into computing than we would have been initially. Back in 90 to 92, computers were very basic, programs were very basic, and there wasn't quite as much networking as there are now. By the time my career had evolved, I saw a lot more need and functionality of computer systems, and evolved from there. After I left active duty service, I decided I want to get more training, so I started grounding myself more in information technology and leveraging that with my interest in investigations and things of that nature. So pretty much I'm pretty well wrapped up in doing a lot of what we call cybersecurity and information technology work and studying, and to me that's fun.
Perfect, perfect. I also have a great love and excitement for cybersecurity as well. So I truly understand, and I'm glad you brought that up. And we'll segue to cybersecurity later on in our discussion. But I want to
Yes.
know from you, how did you get interested in the world of Linux?
When I was a trainer for a training facility in Houston, and my very first introduction was with SUSE Linux. One of my coworkers brought it in, and we started looking at it, and we started playing with a device or a program on SUSE. Started looking at the command line and things like that, and it was interesting to us because we saw it emerging. This was, of course, we might have been later adopters than others, but it was still kind of early. This was in the probably about 2002, thereabouts, and we were interested in integrating it into our network, and we were going to start teaching Linux and leveraging that as a way for our students to have a more varied foundation, because we realized that the power of Linux was very evident, having derived essentially our roots in the Unix world, and Linux is being used all over the place. So from there, it just took off.
Perfect. So I like how you said the power of Linux. And that's why this summit is here, because the power of Linux is just extraordinary. And I truly enjoyed hearing that story about where you were taking the initiative to implement Linux. And that's a wonderful thing. You're certified in LPIC 1. So what made you become certified or want to become certified in LPIC 1 opposed to, say, the other Linux certifications that's out there?
Well, the back in the day, I would say, which for us really isn't that long ago, but when you're talking about certifications and computing, early 2000s, I did go another vendor certification, if you will, and took the time to become Linux certified, but there really wasn't any way to vet my credentials, if you will. It wasn't recognized like we have here. Being able to take a certification with an organization that is known, established, and where I can prove to my employer or those who are interested or that need verification of some competency with Linux, then I have that to refer to. It's easier than saying, well, yes, I can do it. But sometimes an employer or a vendor or somebody may need that insurance to show that you actually have touched it and met at least some standards.
I like how you said that certifications being tied to being insurance for employers, knowing that you have those Linux skills. That's a great statement. How did you gain the amount of experience that you needed before you took the LPIC 1? Did you, since you were working with Linux for so long before, did you like automatically know the exam like before you got to it, or when you got to do the exam? How did that work out for you, experience wise?
Right. No, I'm not a full-time Linux admin, and even those who would consider themselves full-time Linux administrators would still want to study because the exams are have a pretty good breadth and depth to them, if you will, as far as the amount of topics that are covered. For instance, if I did a few commands here and there at work, and I'm comfortable working with Linux or the command line, and I'm able to create user accounts or list a directory or troubleshoot systems, that's well and good, and that's very good. But experience doesn't necessarily substitute for education, and education's not necessarily going to substitute for experience, and the two can go hand in hand. So you can be very well experienced, but a good analogy would be I'm comfortable making sure that my car has gas, I've got oil in it, I can check my spark plugs, things like that, but I wouldn't feel comfortable taking my engine apart and putting it back together. Not saying that it's like that, but it's what I'm referring to is there are other areas of the exam that maybe the average admin doesn't get to touch all the time and maybe not know at a reasonable depth for the exam.
Great. I like how you broke that down, that analogy, excuse me, of being able to remove your car's oil and things of that, but touching the engine is a different beast. So would you say education compared to experience and certification, well, being certified and having experience in Linux are two different beasts, nature of the beast?
Yes, ma'am. For instance, if I get experience working with a certain computer system, let's say in this instance Linux, and everything seems to work, but my experience might not be as broad as it needs to be, so it's more anecdotal. So I'm working on it myself, and that's fine, but there may be some best practices or there may be some techniques that I don't understand properly, and therefore I may be doing them incorrectly, almost like we would want our physicians to have proper training, not just their experience. Of course, experience can be helpful, but it has to be the right experience, just like training. If you're going to work out and go to the gym, you need to have a plan. But even if you have a plan, you need to know how to lift properly and how to pace yourself and how to eat right in order to get the maximum benefit and to do that. So it's kind of like preparing for the exam or knowing this. You may have experience, but there's probably going to be some areas there that you still need to learn about.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So how did you prepare for the LPIC 1?
Well, a lot of stress, I guess, just like with anything, even though you think you're well prepared, you're going to shell out some money for the exam, and people around you, friends, family, or coworkers, know that you may be taking an exam, and while nobody's perfect, you certainly want to do the best you can. So to prepare, I did a lot of reading, obviously. There's a lot of documentation. I did have hands-on with the technology. So, and then I did reach out to try to find some type of study preparation tools. Still, and what I introduced in the training facility that I worked at is what I called, I just termed it what I called a layered methodology. And the way I would prepare is I attended lectures or some type of training. I made sure I went through labs covering the material and the test objectives, and then I used some type of test preparation material, whether it was reading the questions in the end of the book or into various chapters and then writing the answers myself and checking up on those, or if I didn't have a simulator or anything in front of me, typing out the commands I thought would be used in, let's say, Notepad, and then verifying those with the stuff at the, on the questions. So it's along those lines, and, you can only get so far without, without the right preparation.
Understood. Can you name some of those books that helped you with the exam? Or you mentioned labs as well. Can you name labs and books that you used?
Right. I didn't know if I could. Yeah, I can listen.
Yeah.
One that I use quite a bit is I use Cybex, but I would also go online to Amazon and see what they would have. I'm a big fan of electronic books, if you will, so I can log in and touch them wherever I'm at, so I don't have to lug them around. But I like Cybex or anything that would, even from the vendor. So there's a wide variety of Linux sources that you can get and study books. But when I'd go to look at the lab material, one thing that I use and that I've used with the college is TestOuts, who has the module for Linux, and I run my students through that when I teach the Linux course. And so that's good as well. But not only that is also creating, sometimes I create custom labs, or we'd go over material with the students and then I'd create a scenario or go through a scenario based on, information presented in a chapter.
Okay, great. So that website you said was Cybex. Could you spell it out for the users just so they have it? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well, Cybex, it's for Wiley. You can go to www.wiley.com.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to www.wiley.com, and it should bring you to the home page there, and then you can there's a search bar up at the top, and you can type in the Linux.
Okay.
And once you type in there, you will get various resources like the Linux Bible. Mm-hmm. They have listed as one essential, Linux Essentials, and then one of the other basic books is going to be the LPIC or LPIC-1, and it's the Linux Professional Institute Certification Study Guide, and it covers the exams there, so that can be found there as well.
Okay, perfect. And you also mentioned TestOut. I've used TestOut as a result of being at UMUC, so I can attest that it's a great learning tool as well, because it gives you the demonstrations along with the material for how and why a command works.
Yes, ma'am.
So I believe that's www.testout.com. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Perfect. So since you are a professor and you do teach Linux, what are some of the specific commands or concepts that you make sure you try to drill into your students' head before they take any Linux exam or just studying Linux, period?
Okay. Well, with University of Maryland University College, I'm an associate adjunct professor. So presently I am a course chair over the what we call the CMIT 391 course, which covers Linux. And the students there's a lot of material they have to cover when they're going through this course. So one of the skills and one of the things that we hammer into them is that they have to get into the labs. not only understand the material, but we have to get them hands-on and using the material. The vast majority of students that come through the course are Windows-centric. They're used to Microsoft Windows, which is predominant in the workforce and in many organizations. And so they may not get to see as much of the command line or be as comfortable with it as they normally would. So I want them to understand what the environment of Linux is like, the power of the command line, and to not get so wrapped up on what's on the surface, like the eye candy, if you will, but make sure that they're understanding that depending on the flavor of Linux that you use, there may be different variables to get to certain areas on the system. So make sure that they understand the material that they're studying and how to do certain tasks on certain flavors of Linux that they're working with.
Okay, great. So, were there any specific commands that you made sure you knew for the LPIC 1 exam?
Well, I try to go over quite a few. For me, I tried to have a foundation in most of the, if you will, most of the topics that I would see on the command for the command line. For my students, some areas that I want them to be really familiar with and understand is that at any given time, nobody's going to know 100% of a given topic, if you will. So I want to build them up to make them comfortable enough to know that they have resources actually on the system that they can use themselves. They need to know how to go about finding the answers that they need, maybe when they're in the middle of an issue or on a problem. For instance, Linux has a lot of good documentation built in to the operating system itself. And one of the areas that I want them to know is that they can use something called the man pages. And using the man pages, they can go in and they can find some information in there. I also wanted to make sure that they could understand the PWD command, or present working directory, to understand where they're at, as well as the SU command if they had to switch user. And if you use the command SU with no suffix on it, like you can switch to another user, typically the SU command, if you're working as a regular user, then you can switch over to root if you need to run some other commands as well.
Great. Thank you. So we have the man page, you said, PWD, present working directory, right?
Right.
Okay. And then SU to switch users. Great. So,
right. There's a lot more than that. That's just touching the top. But I want to make sure, let them know, to not kick themselves if they didn't know everything, but understand there's places they can go to maybe, get help and find out what they need.
Great. For the LPIC exam, did you have access to the man page or any of the Linux operating system, or is it a multiple choice exam?
Good question on the recent iterations. Most of the time, when you're working in there, I didn't remember coming to that many simulations. I know, for instance, when I've had other vendor certifications, the simulations were limited, but we did have the option for some basic feedback. It's not uncommon for in the LPIC you have a lot of multiple choice, where that's a proven methodology for preparing tests and tests and answers. So that's a vetted way to get information. But you may also have fill in the blank. And when I say fill in the blank, it may say, how would you search for, what's one option to search for help? You can type in man, right? Or how would you display the directory in which you're currently operating? Then you'd type in PWD. And things of that nature. Of course, in the exam, you're not going to get the initial feedback. So knowing these commands, being more familiar with the commands and understanding what they do, you may get that question where you have to produce the answer without any option to go seek for help on the exam. But in the end, we want our users to be, we certainly want them to pass the LPIC, but we also want to have functional, competent IT professionals that can use the technology. And so ultimately that's our goal. We do want them to be successful and pass the exam, but it's important that that they understand while they're preparing for the exam, they need to be functional with the material. Just having a piece of paper is not going to do them any good in the field. So they go hand in hand, and I think this exam does a good job of helping address both areas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Since you're a professor, have you encountered students that know Linux, but when they got to the class that you teach, they weren't as proficient as they should have been?
Yes, I have. I've had scenarios where I've had some what we would consider heavy Linux administrators who are really excellent at what they do, but when come time for exam time to actually touch this, it's kind of like I mentioned before. There's a more breadth than the average admin will see in a day, and that goes for all of us. For instance, if like working with a car, people may be comfortable pumping gas, and they may even go so far as changing their oil, making sure everything's functional and everything's running. But when they get that one problem, that weird problem, something's knocking in the engine, they might not be comfortable diagnosing that, if you will. Same thing with the exam material. It may go into things such as one area that I found many admins were not comfortable with at times were the networking portion, because they're used to working there with the operating system and interacting with the file systems and users, but they may not be as comfortable in, let's say, what subnet they're on or how to check to see what their IP address is. Well, maybe that's not going to be quite that, because checking IP address is done quite a bit, but along the lines of ensuring that they have the right settings for DNS, or maybe understand the purpose of DNS for a given scenario.
Okay. On the LPIC 1, is there a heavy base of networking, or no?
For Linux in general, and that would depend. I guess that would depend on the exam that you would get. And I wouldn't say you're going to have to be like, a network guru to where you're going to have to create a bunch of subnets, or create a subnet mask to address a certain amount of hosts on a given subnet. But with that being said, there are going to be there may be instances where you may have to set a correct IP address, or you may have to understand what you're looking at given a network. And another area where that comes in handy is, I did say networking and subnetting. When I talk to that's where we get into binary. And that can come into play when we start talking about permissions, because in permission settings, if a student can understand the basic binary, they may be able to translate permissions maybe a little bit better on the fly if they see it. Like, for instance, RWX, if they knew what that was in binary, because there's two different ways to set those permissions.
What are the commands to set the permissions?
The command, you mean on a
On the Linux machine?
Okay. When we're looking at setting the permissions, if you're talking about file and folder level permissions, okay, one of the commands that could be used is to change would be chmod. We can change file permissions and ownership there. So we're changing permissions with chmod. But if we wanted to, let's say, change permissions, or excuse me, change ownership, we could use chown, and it's CHOWN, and it would be one word.
Great, great. Thank you. So, is that important as well to know for the exam? Chimod, and Chion?
Yes.
Just to know. Okay, perfect.
Yes,
perfect.
ma'am. So, and so would the thing on breakdown of permissions, because when we look at permissions in Linux, and just barely, again, just touching the surface, because I'm sure some of my more learned colleagues and some of the other lectures will cover it in more detail, but understanding there's separate from Windows, because once again, most of our test takers or people prepping are coming from a Windows background.
Yeah.
They might want to understand the understanding on the file ownership, on user group and other, and how the permissions are run.
Great, great. With the craze of programming now, have you noticed if there's any bash scripting questions on the LPIC one?
That one of the scenarios or the areas that are covered in it, you may come across some information or topics of that later on. I haven't. We did have to have our students familiar with bash or with the command line, and also know what those variables are, or what they could come across on the system itself.
Okay, great, great. So, how has being a certified Linux professional impact your life? I know you're a professor as well, so how did that all change or impact your life by any chance?
Well, it's given me an appreciation for, I guess what I say is the more that I learn about these topics, the more I can appreciate I don't know, because there's so much to learn. For instance, you mentioned about scripts and things like that. When we're working in bash or we're working in another shell, it's handy to be familiar maybe with certain variables, so you can maybe understand what's going on, because like bash, the born again shell, that's probably the one that users are going to see most on it. But as far as being able to appreciate the use of Linux in cybersecurity, you will see probably Linux used a little bit more than you would in a typical Windows environment. And this is because the functionality and possibly the attack surface that we would see. There's Windows, being a 800-pound gorilla on the market, is probably going to sustain. It's going to be more cost effective for me if I'm a bad actor to go after Windows than it would to try to go after Macintosh or Macs, which are certainly becoming more popular, or even a Linux system. But it's not unheard of.
Great. I'm glad you broke that down for the listeners in terms of the difference between Windows being often hacked and attacked opposed to, say, Macs and Linux machines. That's a great thing. So since you mentioned cybersecurity, and you did mention that Linux is wellly known, used in cybersecurity, how would you say someone who is interested in getting into cybersecurity but doesn't have the necessary Linux skills to get into the field, how would you suggest that they go about gaining that Linux experience?
Well, first off, it's important to note that Linux literacy or Linux skill set is not a barrier to entry into cybersecurity. There are many aspects to cybersecurity, and in fact, there may be some who are working within cybersecurity that maybe don't touch Linux quite as much as others may. I've seen highly competent analysts utilize Linux and Macintosh systems to, and particularly Linux, maybe in a virtual machine, if you will, or things along those lines, to possibly look at help analyze malware and things of that nature, where you wouldn't want to do it on a Windows system for obvious reasons. For instance, on a Windows system, and most Windows systems, the path to certain areas that malware would want to attack are going to be the same. or similar or automatic. Maybe not as much on some of these other systems. And then we also get into the topic of digital forensics and how Linux can be used in those instances.
Okay. And your investigations that you do, are they cybersecurity based?
Well, in my past, I was a criminal investigator, and a lot of my stuff had to do with general crimes, everything from petty theft to homicide, violent assaults, if you will. And I did, in my office at the time, I was the person, the go-to person for computer crimes. And although it was much more basic than it would be now with regard to what we're seeing, but I did see some of it. And even now, back to where I'm at, the cybersecurity, if you will, is all about some form of investigation. Same with troubleshooting computers and working with what we do. There are some basics, or there's some foundational topics for the investigative process.
Great, thank you. So what advice would you give someone that's interested in taking the LPIC 1 exam?
Start reading, and absolutely, there you'll probably be able to find somebody somewhere around you. Obviously, if you're interested in the LPIC 1, you're interested for a reason. You're probably going to find somebody that knows it or has used it. So don't be afraid to ask questions, learn and see what the other person is using, but also look at various blogs or communities out online where you can find people who are Linux minded, and look at the study materials. You may even find a Linux users group in your area, so you may be able to find like that, and look for resources. For instance, I'm near the Houston area right now, and they have like a Linux users group. But again, get the material, practice, ask questions, find a training center or somebody that you can train with to do that, and especially don't overlook your local college.
Yeah, great. So you mentioned blogs. Is there a particular blog that you may suggest?
Not right off as far as blog for Linux. I haven't had any that I'd recommend just yet.
Okay. So I just want to say you're telling folks to find someone that uses Linux, that's possibly in a Linux group, and check out some forums or blogs that focus on the LPIC 1 exam. Perfect.
Right. For instance, I guess one I should mention, or some others I can mention, like Linux Magazine.
Okay.
May look out there to see what you might have. Look for something from whatever blog or whatever entity you want to go to. Look at the source or the reputation of the material that's on there, because you don't want to venture off into some areas to where you might be getting bad information, or information that's not going to be too helpful at all.
Yeah. And that's important, since there's so much Linux information out here. You kind of have to vet the good and the bad. So I totally agree with you.
Right, and I believe if you look around, you'll probably find LPIC, some resources there on their site as well.
Great, thank you so much for that, David. So how do you keep your Linux skills current?
I work with some folks that use Linux more often than I do, so from time to time I'll watch what they're doing. I get the benefit of helping teach the material, so I come from an academic perspective. So most of the stuff that I'm looking at is generally from published sources, right, or some of the labs we use, and interaction with my students, because you have people from various backgrounds that have a lot of experience or different ways that they implement or utilize Linux for their business. So I found that very helpful. For instance, I've come across Linux in, let's say, forensic processes, where there's certain flavors of Linux that are geared towards forensics. And using Linux myself at home, I've been able to use it and teach some of my students how to use it to maybe affect the process of file recovery on failed hard drives and things like that.
Great, great. So what version of Linux do you use at your home?
Well, being that it's at home, I've went to mostly Linux Mint.
Okay. And what's the features of Mint? Is it solely based for like digital forensics, or is it just a regular OS?
It's more like it's as close to dare I say Windows than some of the other ones. And it's been pretty popular for those that are interested in just about looking at different types of Linux that you can play with. And, they're all, and get them free. I'd recommend going to distrowatch.com.
Okay.
And over on the far right side of DistroWatch, there will be a hit ranking, if you will, or a way they rate the numbers, or excuse me, the versions of Linux. And I believe right now Mint is the top distro. But I'd found that it was pretty user friendly, and my family could use it readily without any training, because again, most of these flavors of Linux that you're going to find out there, the GUI, or the graphical user interface, is a lot more advanced, or a lot better than it used to be when it was first out. Before, it used to be relegated to what people consider hardcore computer geeks, if you will. And now the average user could probably plug in a Linux system and get online and begin printing. And that, I think, that shows the power of Linux and the organization and the open source nature.
I agree. And you taught me something new today. I've heard of Linux Mint, but I never gave it any second thought until you mentioned it today. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, David. It's truly been a pleasure to speak with you today. Do you have any maybe final takeaways you want to give our audience in regards to LPIC 1?
LPIC 1 is only LPIC 1 is going to be it's not a walk in the park, but it is attainable. And again, make sure you read. Make sure that you consult with others. Don't discount the experience that others bring to the table, whether they're certified or not. You can still learn from them. And I try to find some type of training. So I do the training, I do labs, and then I prepare for the exam. So just use that layered methodology and, stay alert, and I think you'll do fine.
Perfect. So let's go over that one more time. You said you do the trainings, the reading materials, the lab, and what was the last one?
Test prep material
too. Okay.
Because essentially what you're doing, and if you're in a training facility, typically it would be lecture, labs, and then test preparation. Because you're hitting the thing, you're listening to it, right? You're hearing, you're interacting, you're hitting one set of senses. Then with labs, you're also getting the actual hands-on portion of it, because some people learn better with hands-on. So along with the lectures, you should have some type of hands-on, because it's another way of learning. And then you can use the test prep or the preparation material to kind of get a feel for maybe the scope of the questions and the breadth and depth that you want to hit, so you can hit each of the areas properly.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. It's been a true pleasure, and thank you for taking the time out to join us here at this Linux Certification Virtual Summit. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.